Alrighty, so this is a brief review of Racialized class. Okay, so Herbert Gans points out how biologists argue that scientifically there can't be human races, right? Despite this, the majority of people still see and distinguish between races. So he wonders, why should a thing that's about melatonin still structure so much of our social inequality? So skin colors and racial features commonly used to define race are selected because when arranged hierarchically, they resemble the country's class and status hierarchy, with whites on the top and non-whites having less prestige and lower socioeconomic stances. So race functions as more than a class marker. The correlation between race and class is not statistically perfect, but there's a strong enough relationship that we socially use race as a marker of social class. So he argues that other factors indicate socioeconomic status, but a lot of these distinctions are getting less noticeable, making race even more as an important marker of socioeconomic status than before. So since the first settlers, race was established as a social hierarchy that affected livelihood and power. At the bottom of the hierarchy were indentured servants, slaves, and Native Americans. In order to justify slavery, the othering of Africans was necessary so that we could still be a nation of freedom while literally denying any freedom to African Americans. So whenever there's an inequality in society, there's always a social justification to defend it. So different groups have been maligned throughout US history due to their ethnicity or race, as many immigrants were needed in different waves over time to supplement industry and fulfill otherwise other open jobs. Once that group is no longer exploitable, they're vilified in the culture, and they're often denied the legal rights and status of white Americans. So no matter how much wealth, status, and prestige a person has, if they're African American, they're still raced and associated with lower social class status and lower prestige and status. So upward mobility, right, is the goal in our culture. It's not as easy when you're racialized. So some see racism as the heart of the issue in both prejudice and institutional discrimination. But other explanations are class related. So many African Americans were kept away from opportunities that would have afforded them more social mobility, right? Like the GI Bill. Being racially exclusionary meant that a lot of people weren't able to go to college or use those GI Bill funds to buy a home within what became, white flight, suburban, kind of flight from the inner cities to the suburbs when those deeds said whites only on them. Those service members that came back from World War II were just not able to use those funds to get a house in the same way those white families were, which gave them the social mobility to send their kids to college, to have that mortgage to borrow against when something happened, etc., etc. So a lot of people were stuck in poverty in impoverished neighborhoods. And this isn't by accident, right? They redlined these neighborhoods. They cut off opportunities and then basically left people struggling in a situation where at first there were factory jobs and things like that, but then with globalization, all of those things have gone to other countries for cheaper labor. So it's just really left a huge deficit in a lot of these neighborhoods. So when you have no opportunities, you're going to take what you can get, right? And that's what's happening with a lot of people joining the underground economy. They're not doing it because they want to. They're doing it because that's what keeps them fed and clothed and housed. And there's a lot of social stereotypes that see African Americans as suited for service jobs. And the legal racial caste systems like slavery and Jim Crow segregation are over, but a lot of those institutional barriers to success still remain, and that ideology remains in the public consciousness. So daily life in a white-dominated society reminds many African Americans that they're perceived as inferior, and that these reminders are louder and more relentless for the poor, especially young men, right? Like Elijah Anderson talks about in Code of the Street, right? That lack of opportunity causes despair and resentment. And so obviously, if you don't feel like you're going to live for very long, if you don't feel like you have a future, then there's no reason to, stay out of trouble, to prepare for the future. So keeping African Americans from decent jobs and incomes, as well as quality schools and housing, makes more of these available to all the rest of the population. Meaning when we focus on who is affected negatively, but we don't talk about who's privileged in the other side of the coin. So discrimination and segregation may decline significantly only if the rules of the competition change, or if scarce resources like decent jobs become plentiful enough to relax competition. Otherwise, these issues will continue. So this complicates our notion of the status and worth of people when they're multiracial, right? So we can only hope that over time we will stop classifying each other's worth based on our melatonin in our skin and instead based on a person's character and actions.
Martin Luther King Jr. was jailed once in Birmingham, and he said he turned to his white jailer and said, "You know, you and I aren't that much different. There's not a huge gulf that separates us. You don't have control over the institutions which govern your life. You don't have a basic say-so in American democracy, and yet the dominant forces of white supremacy manipulate you into believing you are my enemy." And unfortunately, that's a strategy that hasn't changed from Nixon and before Nixon, George McGovern before that on the Democratic side and the Republican side. And so I think what we have to tell our white brothers who are working class, blue collar cats, is that you're in the same boat as most African American people, as most Latino people. You suffer from the economy equally. If you allow elite white politicians to manipulate you into believing that your real enemy is a black guy who works alongside you in a factory where you're both inhaling toxic chemicals that will lead both of you to die early, as opposed to this elite figure in the American political echelon or corporate structure that is living off of your anxiety about this black guy, you're going down to defeat. And I think what we have to say to them is that we're in a larger same boat in terms of class, in terms of some of the cultural values we share, even if we have different racial approaches to that. It's interesting that we have a language and vocabulary for race in America, but we don't have much of a vocabulary for class. And many people can't make that distinction. Black or white, what about poor or rich? What about health care or non-health care? And when we begin to break the numbers down, the number of white people on welfare, the number of white people who are poor, the number of white people who don't control the government in ways they'd like to see, and the number of white people who say, you know what, you want affirmative action, but why should your kid get an advantage over me? Or you want reparations, why should your kid get an advantage over mine when we don't have any economic wherewithal either? And I say to them, look, it's not either or. What's amazing is that right-wing conservatives become Marxists when it comes to the issue of race. Aha, you better watch out because those black people are taking money out of your pocket. How many black CEOs of major Fortune 500 companies are there? How many black senators in the Senate? How many even black Congress people? How many people where it counts for white people in terms of their livelihood are they subject to black rule? Not many. So when white people back up and begin to make an analysis about how they have been manipulated by these white elites, there will be the possibility of forging a much stronger link between progressive, working class, blue collar, white and black and Latino and red people as opposed to the continued manipulation of white working and corporate elites.
Oh, hey, I didn't see you there. So if you're like most Americans, you probably say to yourself all the time, systemic racism. Is that really a thing? Did you know that in 2010, black Americans made up 13% of the population, but only had 2.7% of the country's wealth? That the median net worth for a white family was $134,000, but the median net worth for a Hispanic family was $14,000, and for black Americans it was $11,000? Know that the median wealth for a single white woman has been measured at $41,000, but for a Hispanic woman it was $140, and for a black woman $120? Did you know that? Do you know what that's called? That's called systemic racism. And yes, it's really a thing.
To learn more about systemic racism, visit raceforward.org and donate today to support racial justice.
Alrighty, so moving on to is capitalism gendered and racialized? Okay, so the reading talks about how capitalism is gendered and racialized through two intersecting historical processes. So the first is industrial capitalism, which was dominated by white males. So it resulted in a gender and race segregated labor force with wage inequalities and society-wide gender division of caring labor, right? That expectation of women to take care of kids, that kind of thing. The second intersecting historical process is the gendered and racialized practices become embedded in and replicated through the gendered substructures of capitalism itself. So when it comes to segregation of work and inequality of financial compensation, this is by design. So separating caring labor from the economy and preferencing some forms of work over others, and saying some are worth paying for and some are not worth paying for, meaning child rearing, house cleaning, only worth paying for when it's not your biological kid, when it's not your house, right? So the structure of capitalism is built on these inequalities. Industrial capitalism is historically a white male project and continues to be so in the modern era. So this means that white men are the owners of industry and those who hold the most power in society. So capitalism, like other parts of society, was affected by the ideology at the time in which it was created, right, or which it was formed. And that time period valued white men above all other social groups, as it formed in Britain, Europe, and the US. So this affects segregation and wage inequality. So capitalism was built on the forced labor and institution of slavery, and the wage labor force was sharply divided by gender as well as race and ethnicity. So the gender division of labor became the divide in paid and unpaid labor. So Omian would not argue that the U.S. was a racial dictatorship for 258 years, from 1607 to 1865. After the abolition of slavery in 1865, severe exploitation, exclusion, and domination of blacks by whites perpetuated racial divisions cutting across gender and some class divisions, consigning blacks to the most menial, low-paying jobs in agriculture, mining, and domestic service. And a lot of early industrial workers themselves as well were immigrants. So this gender and racial ethnic division of labor still exists, but now on a global basis. The experiences of racial oppression are built into industrial capitalism, and this varies, though, by gender within these racial and ethnic groups. So women from different racial and ethnic groups were incorporated differently than men, and differently from each other, into developing capitalism in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Unequal pay patterns went along with sex and race segregation and exclusion. Differences in the earnings and wealth of women and men became part of the structure of capitalism, as unequal wages were justified by beliefs about virtue and entitlement. So white men were seen as the most capable and suited for the most valued and highly paid positions in society. And these beliefs about different groups and their social value affected their job opportunities and wages. And these men had advantages that they used to shore up more opportunities and power in the labor market, such as forming labor unions that were racially segregated. So white masculine identity and self-respect were complexly involved in the divisions of labor and wages. So as time goes by and history takes place, these patterns continually recreate gender and racial inequalities as essential elements in present capitalism. Segregating practices are a part of the history of white masculine-dominated capitalism that establishes class as gendered and racialized. Even as more women and people of color enter fields dominated by white men, like politics, for example, the actions of those who hold leadership positions are shaped within networks of practices sustained by images of masculinity. So, this clip I'm going to throw in here, which I doubt they're going to actually sue me over because it's Democracy Now! And they're pretty awesome, is the idea that globalization has really moved those horrible factory conditions from 100 years ago in the U.S. to places all over the world. And since we're divorced from where our products come from, we rarely reflect on our part in the extreme exploitation of others that's needed to support our current American lifestyle. So I'm going to include that in here right here.
One. Well, to mark the 100th anniversary of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, the Institute for Global Labor and Human Rights has published a new report titled Triangle Returns: Who Will Protect Today's Working Girls? The Institute also produced this video to accompany the report. It's narrated by Charles Kernighan.
On December 14th, 2010, just 3 months shy of the 100th anniversary of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in New York, a fire broke out at the Hamin factory in Bangladesh, in the outskirts of Dhaka. It was an 11-story building. It was lunchtime. There were workers in the cafeteria on the 11th floor, and they started to smell smoke. They didn't panic. They did just what the workers did at the Triangle. They started to go towards the exit. The workers tried to get out the exit, and the flames were so great and the smoke was so dense, they had to retreat. They ran through the cafeteria to the other side of the building, the west side, and they tried to go out the fire exits, and the exit doors were locked. They were trapped. Those workers jumped off the top of the building from the 11th floor. They leapt off the building for the same reason, so that their parents could have their bodies and they could be mourned correctly and they could be buried correctly. Workers on the ground thought these were bales of clothing that were being thrown out the windows. It's word for word the exact same thing. At the Triangle factory, the exit door was locked. The exit door was locked at Hamin 100 years later at the factory fire at Hamin in Bangladesh. And you know what the workers told us? They said that often management locks the exit gates during a fire so that the garments can't be stolen. 29 workers were killed. Over 100 workers were injured, 36 of them seriously and were hospitalized. The management paid the families of the deceased workers $2,080 as compensation. That's what a life is worth in the developing world now. This is going on still in the global economy today. Not one change. In fact, it gets worse. In Triangle, they made 14 cents an hour. But when you adjust that for inflation, that 14 cent an hour in 1911 is worth $3.18 today. The workers at the Hamin factory in Bangladesh on the outskirts of Dhaka, they're making at the top wage 28 cents an hour. That means that they're earning, their wages in Bangladesh today are 1/10 of what wages were in the United States 100 years ago. We are racing to the bottom.
Charles Kernighan, director of the Institute for Global Labor and Human Rights, formerly the National Labor Committee, now based in Pittsburgh. Talk more about this, Charlie. Those images are incredible.
Well, it's eerily similar to the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. And the workers in Triangle were working 14 hours a day. At the Hamin factory in Bangladesh, they worked 12 to 14 hours a day, but they worked 7 days a week. The Triangle workers got 1 day a week off. The owner of the factory, very powerful man, he just, after the fire, he said that it was sabotage on the part of the workers. He owns a newspaper and he owns a television station. So without the slightest bit of evidence, he just says it was sabotage. And they're so different from the Triangle factory, there's been no investigation. There's been nothing comes out of it. The workers have just died. In Bangladesh, the workers, last summer, we were there in July, they went out on protests for a wage increase. They were begging, demanding for 35 cents an hour. Imagine that. Walmart and Gap and the rest of the companies, they were begging, demanding,
what do you
marching.
mean Walmart and Gap?
Well, because these are all the labels that produce there. In this particular factory, it was Gap children's toddlers' pants that were being sewn in the factory. They accounted for 50% of the production. 400,000 pairs of Gap pants were burnt in the fire. So Gap was a major player. So was Phyllis Van Heusen and J.C. Penney. Some Abercrombie and Finch, and a little bit of Target. But so these are all the major labels produced there. Bangladesh right now exports $4 billion worth of apparel to the United States each year, and they're the third largest exporter. 97% of all garments are made offshore now. So, in other words, what we've done is we've taken the sweatshops from the 1911, and we've just moved them to Bangladesh. Now, when the workers in Bangladesh started to fight back, there's 3.5 million workers, garment workers, 80% of them young women. When they fought back, and they demanded a 35 cent an hour wage, which any corporation could easily pay, they were attacked by the police. They were beaten, they were clubbed, they were shot at with rubber bullets, they were hosed down with these very powerful water cannons, which just swept the women off the streets. And they put a dye in the water so they could be arrested later on. So they couldn't get the dye off their clothing or their bodies. So, and this is, we are racing so fast backwards in the global economy that right now these workers, don't stand a chance.
Well, Charlie, I want to ask you specifically, because you mentioned this question of all of the production being sent offshore. We're constantly told that we're living in a post-industrial society and that manual labor is no longer the thing that drives the economy, when the reality is that there are more industrial workers in the world today than there ever were. It's just that they're not as much in the advanced countries, and basically the worst aspects of capitalism have been outsourced or offshore to these other countries, and yet we believe that we live in a post-industrial society, and we act as if all the goods that we have around us somehow appeared and weren't made by someone somewhere in some factory, as you say, with conditions even worse than they were here in the early 20th century in the United States.
Okay, so when it comes to masculinities in capitalism, some challenge the notion of masculinity as a singular ideal and argue that we should refer to them as masculinities, because in any society at any one time, there's several ways of being a man. Being a man involves cultural images and practices, so it always implies a contrast to an unidentified femininity. And again, hegemonic masculinity itself is defined as the taken for granted form attributed to leaders and other influential figures at a particular historical time. So hegemonic masculinity legitimizes the power of the people that have it. And more than one type may exist at the same time. So being a CEO or being a professional athlete are two forms, but there are related aspects of that same performance. So the ideology of capitalist markets is imbued with a masculine ethos. Masculinity and ideology behind it continue to be a part of what shapes the ongoing understandings and nature of capitalism. So hegemonic masculinities and violence are deeply connected within capitalist history. The violence of colonialism, right, the genocide, forced relocation, cultural genocide, slave trade itself, and slavery as an institution are really all about linking violence and power, or the power of some people to control the lives of others. So metaphors of violence shape understandings of masculinities to be the top of the corporate ladders to dominate or conquer others. Or in institutions like the police force or the military, the ability to wield violence is linked to masculine performance and ability. So when you look at different cultures, their hegemonic masculinities have similarities and differences. So each culture has their own slice of these issues related to their social and cultural history. Hegemonic masculinities are also defined in contrast to subordinate masculinities, whether it be by class, race, or sexuality. And these masculinities are not stable images, right? They change. The ideas of what they mean change when society changes. Okay, so here I just gave an example. The perception that we have of female leaders versus male leaders, right? And a lot of this just has to do with our understandings of the role of men and women in society, right? We have a lot of these terms, right? Like if a woman is very strong and very assertive, very self-knowing, very controlling, powerful, she's a bitch. She's an ice queen, right? There's something wrong with her. And so I gave this example here on the left that was a research study done within the labor market, looking at feedback received in critical reviews. So how men and women face even job performance reviews varies a lot. And this has a lot to do with the amount of constructive or negative feedback that they receive. So you see it couldn't be more skewed when you're looking at feedback received in critical reviews. Versus reviews including critical feedback. Still, you see quite a difference. So it's pretty interesting just to see how our societal notions from the past, even though women are now in the labor force in many ways and have moved into a lot of more male-dominated positions, the way that we interpret them is based on that. And again, the same goes for men, meaning we expect a man to be controlling and domineering and assertive. So if he's very kind or sweet, like I had this boss, probably one of the best bosses I've ever had, which is kind of saying a lot because I've had a lot of great bosses, actually. I've had a lot of terrible bosses, but also a lot of great bosses. But in fairness, I've had like a lot of bosses. So anyway, this guy was just the best, like probably the best boss I've ever had, because he was thoughtful and smart and insightful and didn't care about that gender stereotype nonsense. So he wasn't very, how do I say this? I was surprised the first time I heard someone say something negative about him using homophobic slurs, right? As a guy who's like married and has 2 kids, it's not about his sexuality. It was about him not performing gender appropriately to my male coworker. My male coworker expected that when someone did something wrong, they would get yelled at. Instead, he sat them down and had like a chat about what, the expectations were and how to fulfill that appropriately the next time, meaning constructive feedback. And my coworker didn't understand this, meaning just assumed that he should yell, that he should be angry, and started, referring to him in homophobic ways as a result. And so I just think that that's obviously one example, but I'm sure you have your own that you've experienced in your life when we hold men and women to different standards. So if a man is very strong and assertive, we're like, good for him. If a woman is, we're like, what a bitch, right? But the flip side is true too. We expect women to be emotional and emotive. And what if a man is? What if a man is crying, right? What if he's like, oh, I need to go because I need to go to my kids' soccer practice or a PTA meeting or something like that? They will also be looked down on. So anything that's gender asymmetrical, those values have made their way into the institution of work in a lot of deep ways that we don't even think about because they're just based in social interaction.